Okay, once again, welcome. We are at the top of the hour, so I am very much looking forward to getting started today and glad that all of you could join us. I know we have some folks still trickling in, but we'll jump in with our housekeeping and get started. So welcome everyone to our 7-part series, Communicating Product Safety. The series, as you know, has been developed by the Society of Product Safety Professionals in cooperation with ADK Information Services. So a big thank you to those two organizations for bringing this really important education to the product safety community. As this is a 7-part webinar series, I know many of you were able to join the sessions that have already taken place, but for those of you who haven't, please know that all 7 of the sessions are being recorded, and they will all be available on the SPSP website at the conclusion of the series. So far, we've heard from industry veterans who have shared their expertise and experience in this communications field, this area of skills relating to overall organizational communications. We took a deep dive with Michael Del Negro into communicating with the C-suite and learned some strategies and tactics there, as well as some academic opportunities. We heard from former CPSC attorneys about communicating to regulators and communicating within that regulatory setting, which certainly can be different than communicating within our own organizations. And finally, we had a very robust 90-minute panel discussion about the human side of communications and tips and techniques that can facilitate successful communications within our organizations or external stakeholders, as well as things to not do when we're thinking about that process and engaging in those discussions. Our final 3 sessions are taking place today. So we are starting now with a terrific session. I'll introduce our speaker in just a moment, but we will be continuing with our final 3 today. We have some breaks built in, so I certainly hope you all can take the time to stay with us for most of today. So before we jump into our first session of the day, I'd just like to remind everyone that we are very much encouraging questions and dialogue throughout the sessions. That's one of the great things about this virtual environment. We can create that dialogue in the chat. You can share anecdotes. You can communicate with your fellow attendees here today. And you can use the Q&A function. You'll see the icon at the bottom of your screen to enter questions. Now, as you listen to the session today, enter your questions as you think of them. We will be able to tackle questions at the end, but certainly interspersed throughout our remarks this morning as well. So with that, I am very, very pleased to introduce our first speaker today, David Kosnoff. David is the Vice President Quality Assurance at Hasbro, and he is an industry veteran. He has a tremendous foundation in the product safety community and is a frequent speaker on many of the circuits that we all participate in. So I am very excited to hear David speak this morning, and he'll be sharing some information with us about crisis communications, using some of his own experience as anecdotal information there. So without further ado, please share your questions as you think of them, and I will turn the floor over to David. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Lisa. And thank you to SPSP and ADK for inviting me to relive some of the most painful days from my professional history. But I get to do this a couple times a year or something similar, and it's always good to help make sure that my hair doesn't regain any color that it may have lost over the years. Let me see. I'm going to... Let's get to the right. Of course, it worked great beforehand. There we go. Hopefully you can see my slides now.
Nope, not yet, David.
Not yet.
There we go.
Great.
You're all good.
Okay. So subtitle here, What I Learned in the Year of the Recall, which in it of itself is a bit of a misnomer. Many people like to refer to 2007 as the year of the recall. As you'll see, it all began before 2007, and it extended well beyond 2007. But we'll touch on some of that. The bulk of the communication piece of it that I'll touch on was from the fall of 2006 through really late 2007. All right, so it all began with neodymium iron boron. That's a difficult set of words to say, difficult to understand. But in late 2005, there was a really tragic fatality associated with magnetics play sets, where a young boy named Kenny Sweet swallowed a couple of magnets that had come out of the play sets, and they perforated his intestines, and which led to sepsis and eventually death. I got involved with this shortly after I moved into a brand new role in product safety at Mattel, when I left the American Girl division and joined their product integrity team. The first day or first week, I can never remember exactly, I was on the job, but one of the directors who worked for me came to me and said, there has been an incident with Polly Pocket's quick click figures. There's been a serious injury involving magnets. We're going to have to file a 15B report with the CPSC. And I understood about two of the words that were in that sentence. I didn't even know what Polly Pocket was. I have boys, and so I wasn't even familiar with the brand, having been very much indoctrinated into the American Girl way of life at Mattel. But I quickly learned, and we learned that associated with these neodymium iron boron, or NIB magnets, was what I will call a newish phenomenon. And I'll say newish because it seemed to be new until we did digging as part of the ASTM committee, working on trying to figure out how to create a standard around these magnets. And we realized then that the radiologists had been reporting about these cases of children ingesting magnets and the magnets forming three-dimensional structures in their intestines for years. But they'd been reporting about it in obscure radiological journals. And as a matter of course, we weren't reading obscure radiological journals, and it wasn't raising to the attention of the regulators. It wasn't raising to the attention of the standard setting bodies. And so it was just going on. And the incidents were few and far between. Some of the doctors involved were talking about 1 in a million, 1 in a billion chance of something like this occurring. But suddenly we started seeing several of them in a relatively short period of time. And all of that led to a lot of work trying to explain what was happening. And in 2006, Mattel ended up doing a recall involving many of their magnetic products. And I became known by our CEO at the time as Dr. Flux. That was because the way that you describe magnetic force is that equation in the bottom center of the slide. Which is way too complicated for most engineers, and definitely too complicated for the general public, and definitely too complicated for our CEO to talk about. And as part of the standard setting process, there was the Mattel lab developed a measurement which became known as magnetic flux index, which owes a little bit to the Back to the Future franchise, but it became a relatively simple way to describe the amount of force between two magnets, either attracting or repelling, and was both repeatable and reproducible in a lab, so we could create a standard by which magnets that had been around and played with for thousands of years, literally thousands of years, like the ferrite magnets and the magnets on refrigerators that have had no reports of this type of injury, how those could be separated from the small, powerful magnets, which is how we started referring to them, because that is easy to understand. We started referring to the small, powerful magnets. We started referring to magnetic flux index, and we were able to craft a story around what was going on, why these magnets were different from the old refrigerator magnets with the letters and the numbers that everyone remembers from their youth, that again had no issues. And it created a way to talk about the problem that we hope people could understand and could distinguish, okay magnets from not okay magnets, or potentially not okay magnets, as well as describing how the issue wasn't a single magnet. The issue was when you had multiple loose magnets that were ingested in a relatively short period of time. It was a complex situation, and we were attempting very much to not dumb it down, but simplify it in a way that our CEO could talk about, the various presidents of different geographic groups could talk about with their regulators, and that we could also describe it to regulators, standard setting bodies, state attorneys general, whoever happened to be interested in wanting to talk to us about this. We needed a way to describe it in simple yet accurate terms. And the accuracy is pretty important there. So it started with the magnets, but I think, as all of us probably remember, it didn't end with the magnets. It led to lead. In 2006, there were 3 CPSC recalls for lead in toys. In 2007, there were 40. And that isn't even the best way to measure it, because that was how many announcements there were. And several of those announcements covered multiple toys. And a better way to look at it is probably how many units were recalled. Unfortunately, the database that CPSC has doesn't have that information going back in a sliceable and diceable way to 2006, but I've started looking at it, and there's definitely some big numbers there. And lead is something that is not new. We've known the problems of lead for many centuries. It's been regulated since 1973 in the US, and even before that. But suddenly we were seeing lead in paint again, and nobody was entirely sure why. And to go back again to the fact that this was not really, 2007 wasn't the only year of the recall. This is just lead in toy recalls. And you can see they spiked in 2007, but they weren't much lower in 2008. And the interesting thing that happened in between then, mandatory testing. So now we're testing more and we're finding more. And that might imply that there may have been more before, but we weren't testing enough to see it. And if I were a betting man, and I'm not a betting man, but if I were a betting man, I would say that there were more than 3 cases of lead in surface coatings in 2006. They just either weren't identified or weren't acted upon. Okay, so now you've got magnets, you've got lead, you've got Jon Stewart going on the Daily Show talking about a bajillion toys recalled for small part lead magnet choking hazards, none of which was accurate, but it's a nightmare from a PR standpoint. So as product safety professionals, what do we need to be working on here? Well, one of the things we need to make sure that we're doing is communicating to the right people with the right information in the right tone. And part of that is identifying who your stakeholders are. And this is going to vary from company to company. It's going to vary based on the scope of the crisis. It's going to vary based on the nature of the crisis. But at the very least, you certainly internal stakeholders of your CEO and C-suite, your corporate communications team, or you probably have something similar if you don't call them corporate communications, but they're going to be critical in helping frame both the story, the way it is released, the way it is talked about. If you're a public company, your investor relations are going to be important, and there's going to be, there may be issues about when it is reported, and you may, if you know about it and you're working with the CPSC ahead right before a financial reporting deadline, there may need to be a disclosure included in the footnotes that there may be something material coming. And so you really need to make sure that you work with your investor relations team and the legal teams and the finance teams to make sure that anything that is required to be disclosed in a timely manner is so disclosed. Finance, depending on the size of the recall, it may or may, and the size of your company, it may or may not be materially significant, but that is something that your finance team is going to have to help you determine. Obviously, the operations planning, sourcing, because your customers are going to want to know, are we going to get replacements? Or is there going to be a substitute item? What's good, are there other items that are impacted? All of those things you're going to need a cross-functional team working with. Your consumer care or customer service, or however you refer to them, they're going to be the ones taking they're going to become frontline communication very quickly once that recall goes public. And they need talking points, again, that are accurate, but easy to understand, and provide enough information without providing too much information. And that's a balancing act. There are other groups internally, external stakeholders. Obviously, you've got your regulators, your direct customers, if you sell through retailers and distributors, your end consumers. Outside counsel I am listing as an external stakeholder because they're going to be often critical in how you work with the regulators. And if there's a chance, like if you live in the United States, that there might be some litigation that comes out of this, then, again, you need to start looking at how you are preparing for that potential litigation as well. Your investors and the rating agencies are going to want to know more. How did this happen? How are you making sure it can't happen again? Is it a general risk factor associated with your segment or your sector, or is it something particular about your company that that led to this recall? You may decide that this is bigger than you can handle all by yourself, and you may need to engage with some reverse logistics or recall service providers. Hopefully, you've got those already lined up as part of your recall planning program. If not, you may want to think about it, because particularly if you're dealing with multi-jurisdictional recalls, being able to do reverse logistics, issue refunds, provide replacement parts is difficult anyway, but as you deal with multiple countries, it becomes exponentially more difficult. One of the critical things as we talk about communication is crisis communication training. Not everybody needs this, but the people who are going to be the public faces of the company really should have some training in crisis communications. That when this popped up at Mattel, we made a conscious decision to engage with outside help for this. We worked with a firm called Weber Shandwick, and they helped us train the executives, prep them for the kinds of questions they might get, frame the responses again in ways that were accurate but simple, and also ways that didn't necessarily lock us into a corner before we were ready to be painted into a corner. It's kind of like preparing for a deposition, maybe slightly less painful, more painful, but it is painful because these experts are going to be asking you the tough questions, and it's important that whoever it is that you decide is going to be that public face, and there may be more than one of them, is exposed to those questions before they get asked so that they can form an answer. And it's your role as the product safety professional. You may be one of those faces. I was lucky enough, unlucky enough to be one of those faces back in 2000 and the fall of 2007, which my older son was thrilled with years later when he Googled me and saw the clip from CNN still showing up. But it's important to know, be prepared for that. And there are firms that specialize this. You may have the expertise to do it internally, but it's really important to prep people before they go out in front of a camera, before they take a call from the press, before they are appearing in front of a congressional hearing. There's a number of different ways that your group may get exposed, and you want to make sure that they're ready. It's also really important as part of that training not to go off script. It can be very easy to want to ad lib. A lot of these people are professional communicators, and they want to make things up as they go. But particularly when you're talking to your marketing and your sales teams, you really need to get them focused on staying on script and only sharing the information that has been vetted and approved and validated, because the last thing you want is inaccurate information getting out there. Particularly, there's going to be plenty of inaccurate information. You just don't want it coming from you and your team. And then the last is avoiding technobabble. That's a term of art that I think originated with some Star Trek script writers when they needed to figure out how they were going to get out of some problem. But neodymium, iron, boron magnets became small, powerful magnets. Complex equations for magnetic force all turned into the flux index. Multi-tiered subcontracting, which is accurate, became undisclosed subcontractors, which was also accurate and a little bit easier to understand. Talking about a parts per million levels of lead, again, which is very specific, but not particularly meaningful to the average Joe or even the average Jill regulator, became impermissible levels of lead, equally accurate. And what we wanted to do was avoid discussions of, was it a safe level? Was it an unsafe level? Because there are plenty of pediatricians out there. There are plenty of toxicologists out there who will say there's no safe level of lead. But there are equivalency calculations you can make based on, eating a chip of lead paint, house paint that had lead intentionally added versus a tiny dot on a toy, and how many toys would need to be licked clean of the lead in order to get an equivalent level ingested. And then this one was brilliant, and I can't take any credit for it, but multi-point double redundant testing of raw materials, WIP, and finished goods all boiled down into the 3-point check. And for those of you who were around or remembering 2007, you would have heard Tom Dabrowski, and who was our head of operations, describing passionately the 3-point check that Mattel was going to put in place, where we were going to check raw materials, we were going to check it in process, and we were going to test every finished good before it ever was shipped. And we did that, and it was one of those things that this is one of those where it was discussed publicly before we were actually ready and figured out how to implement it, but it very much framed what the implementation was going to look like. And frankly, it worked. It was successful in really clamping down on any new lead paint related issues. There certainly, as we tested more, we discovered more. And we stopped those shipments and we notified regulators if that had gone out. But it was a brilliant piece of framing describing the 3-point check. Sometimes communicating means listening. One of the memories, I won't say fondest memories, but one of the memories that I will never forget involved when Frank Gibbs, who many of you may know, and I joined Brian Stockton, who was the head of our international group at the time in Brussels. And we had a meeting with Commissioner Kuneva, and she lectured us for 2 hours about how irresponsible we were, and how we should have known better, and how we just weren't doing enough to protect children. And we sat there and we nodded and we were polite and we didn't refute any of it. And she needed to say what she needed to say, and she needed to get it out there into the public record. And so our job was really to listen and not respond directly, other than to thank her for her comments and her remarks. Similarly, when if your CEO gets the pleasure of testifying in front of Congress, a lot of what goes on in those hearings is not going to be inquisitive, it's going to be expository. And the members of Congress are going to have things that they just want to say. And again, it's training you to listen without making faces, without rolling your eyes when there are inaccuracies done. But again, that's all part of that crisis communication training that it's really super important to go through. And sometimes people just have honestly different points of view. And it's not for you to be having battles in the public at this point. While some firms may choose to do that, Mattel, I think, wisely chose to take accountability, take responsibility for what happened. Not to have a big public fight with regulators about whether or not it was safe or not safe, but to say, this happened, we are sorry, we won't let it happen again, and we're going to move forward, and here are the changes that we're putting in place in order to make sure that it doesn't happen again. Very different than how some companies have reacted, where there are public battles. Those tend to not have a lot of winners. So my recommendation is listen, be cordial, be polite, but the time for fighting may come later in the courts, but it's not during that big initial communication phase. So again, sort of to recap and focus on your role as a product safety professional. The first is assume positive intent. When you come to your safety committee, your executive committee, whoever it is that you need to notify that something not so great has happened, there may be questions asked about, do we really need to report this? Can't we just sweep this under the rug? Don't assume that those questions are based on an evil nature. Don't assume that they're trying to game or cheat the system. It's better to assume we haven't done a great job of explaining the situation, and how can we help you better understand what the actual, what happened and what the requirements are now that we are in this spot. Remain calm. One of my, the executive coaches that I had over the years talked about voice modulation, tonal modulation, volume modulation, and how most people do it exactly wrong. Most people, when they are upset or delivering bad news, tend to get very animated, very emotional, lots of voice modulation, lots of volume modulation, lots of yelling and screaming. The reality is that people take bad news much better if you can deliver it in a calm, level-toned, level way. The best example that I have from my own personal experience with this was on an American Airlines flight that was supposed to be leaving JFK, bound for Miami. And as we were accelerating down the runway, there was a very loud boom. And the captain came on in their practice Texan drawl and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, we've had a mechanical issue. We're going to circle for a little while and reduce our fuel load, and we will be returning to JFK. Don't worry, everything is under control, and the flight attendants will make sure that you're comfortable, and the crew on the ground is already working towards rerouting everybody and getting everybody rebooked." And so we circle for a couple hours, and then we land, and there are flashing lights and emergency vehicles lining the runway. It was clearly a little more than just a minor technical issue, but the captain and crew did an amazing job of keeping everybody calm, and nobody was panicking. And that's what we really need the product safety community to think about. Maybe less the Texas drawl, but that notion, and airline pilots are trained in how to communicate in a calming way when there is something bad that might happen. And I think there's something for all of us to learn from that. We also need to make sure, and this is really important in our roles, to keep it accurate. As the story making develops, and there are, because there will be a narrative that your company wants to tell. And as that narrative develops, part of your role as a product safety professional is making sure that the narrative doesn't veer so far off course that it becomes inaccurate. There will be times when, again, something gets said or misheard, and it suddenly takes on a life of its own. And you need to figure out how to reel that back in and say, wait, time out. That's not what really happened here. What really happened was X, which led to Y, which led to Z. And let's talk, if you want to reframe that, let's talk about how we can describe that in a different way that might be more palatable, but is no less accurate. And I guarantee you at some point in your career that will come up, where there is a desire to reframe something in a way that stretches the truth beyond your level of comfort. And that's part, again, not ill intent, usually not understanding how the supply chain works or how the production works or how the design worked. And because we are deeply ingrained and involved in all of that, we really become sort of the filters, the fact checkers throughout this process. We need to help with the risk assessment and risk management. Again, there are not every non-compliance that is going to lead to a recall may necessarily be a matter of imminent hazard, death, or destruction. There may just simply be a non-compliance that needs to be reported. I see Don just asked a question. Do you have any specific recommendations for communicating with, whoops, I lost it. Advocacy groups such as Kids in Danger, Consumer Federation of America, or Consumer Reports. Again, if I can make a plug for joining and attending ICVSO, joining and attending the SPSP, these are forums where you can forge relationships with some of these advocacy groups. They may not always be your friends. They may not always, you may have competing priorities, but having those relationships ahead of time, as a former colleague of mine used to say, making friends before you need them, it becomes much easier to have that communication with, it becomes easier to have the difficult conversations if you already have a relationship. And that's not only true of the advocacy groups, it's true of the regulators as well. Get to know your regulators, get to know who you're going to be dealing with if there ever is an issue, so that when you make that call and say, hey, there's something that happened that we need to let you know about, they know who you are, they know what your background is, they know where you're coming from, and it just makes the conversation a whole lot easier. And the other thing that I would say is, again, avoid confrontational kinds of language in these discussions. I think Mattel and Bob Eckert, who was CEO at the time, really, he had studied the Tylenol recalls that happened before that, and he really took those to heart in forming the response to the Mattel recalls, in taking responsibility, apologizing, and being public about what steps are being taken to ensure that it can't happen again. And the more transparency you can bring, the better. Now, it's not going to be complete transparency, but the more transparent you can be with the advocates, with the lawmakers, with the regulators, I think the better off it's going to be for people. Thanks for the question, Don. So we talked about, in many jurisdictions, there are timelines for when you need to report after you become aware of a situation. Depending on the nature of the situation, depending on the regulatory framework that is in place in those markets, whether or not you actually sold product or shipped product to those markets, there may be competing and conflicting deadlines. And working through how you're going to notify which regulators in the right order as quickly as possible, hitting all the timelines and hitting all the deadlines, requires a bit of ballet. And but again, it's something to make sure that your recall plan thinks about, and you can plan for, and you can have actions for. Who's your primary regulator? Who are the super important additional regulators that need to be notified? Who have reporting deadlines? What triggers those? What are the triggering actions for those reports? It differs, and there's not a universal standard for notifying, when to notify and how soon to notify, but it's really important if you're doing business in those countries to understand what those requirements are. We talked about the fact that Mattel engaged with Weber Shandwick. They were hugely helpful in preparing me personally and our CEO and our presidents for being in front of the camera, being in front of the microphone, being on the phone with people, making sure that we knew what our stance was, what Mattel's story, our version of the facts, which were accurate but we wanted a specific story to be the narrative. And they really helped both frame the narrative and grill us into it and prepare us for being in those not always comfortable positions where you're being asked tough questions. And certainly last but not least, and you probably have heard this from a number of other speakers this week or over last week and this week, is prepare before you need it. Have a plan for what to do in the case of a crisis, or maybe a recall won't become a crisis. Not all of them do, but be prepared for what you're going to do, who you need to notify, who's going to be the public face, who you're going to engage with. Do you have outside counsel lined up wherever you might need them? Because one firm may not be able to cover the entire world, particularly if you sell globally. You may need local counsel in some of those markets. And having that all in a nice binder on the shelf that you can pull out, and you open it up and you say, here we are. And then you just start ticking down the checklist. It makes it a whole lot easier than trying to make it up on the fly. So really encourage you to prepare, document, and test. And by test, if you haven't had a recall in a while, you probably ought to schedule a mock recall to make sure that everything works and that you've got the right contacts. People change jobs, they change roles, people leave the company. And so do you have the right contact list internally for everyone who needs to know? Going through that on a regular basis helps you know that when it's needed, everything is ready and you're all set to go. Questions?
David, on that note, as you wrapped up that slide, how often would you recommend going through that auditing process of your crisis plan and offering training to the appropriate people?
So I would recommend exercising the mock recall at least once a year if you don't have the opportunity to do an actual recall during that same time frame. If you have the opportunity to do an actual recall, you may not need to do the mock recall because you'll have gone through the book, you'll have gone through and you'll know which emails bounce back that they are no longer with the company. And you'll have to figure out who is in that role now and who to communicate with. But overall, I think it's, let me stop sharing here. Overall, if you can go through that at least once a year, I think you're going to be much better prepared when and if and when a crisis should occur.
Excellent. Thank you. We do have a quick question here about, will this presentation be available as a recording? Yes, afternoon. Within a few days, the entire website, so you can access it there. So David, another question that maybe you touched on a little bit when you answered John's question, but I'd like to explore a little bit is, you've talked us through the crisis communications plan and how to get everyone on board and the responsibilities of the various parties here. And, if we find ourselves in this situation and we've done everything right, we've done everything correctly, we think we may be in a good spot, but the media or another external stakeholder group takes a hold of a narrative that we don't want out there, or, get something wrong in the process and it takes off. How do we mitigate that kind of potential damage? And, what are your recommendations for facing that kind of a situation?
No, so scenario planning, right? Knowing that it may occur and presumably, well, I won't, in some cases, the media may be aware of an issue before the company is. But in most cases, the company is aware of the issue they have at least a little bit of lead time before the media becomes aware of it. And again, having a clear narrative developed that the company wants to get forward is helpful. There will, look, this is not unique to product safety, right? I think we have seen, plenty of cases where there are conflicting views of what facts are and what reality means within the last couple of years. And without taking a side left or right, both sides think the other side is crazy and is irrational for not recognizing what the truth is. One of the things I really enjoyed from Michael's presentation earlier in the series was his recognition of the biases that we all carry. And I think it's important that as you're working through the formulation of your narrative and of your communication plan, that you recognize that those biases exist, both internally and external views of your organization. And past performance or past instances may create a halo or a pitchfork of how your organization is viewed. If you have been a responsible company historically, you may get the benefit of the doubt. If you have a long series of unfortunate events, they may immediately assume the worst, and then you're not just battling the facts of the current case, you're battling all those previous facts as well, or opinions. So I wish I had a magic answer here. If I did, I think every political consultant in the world would want to know what the answer was. I think the best is to recognize that there are going to be, or that, again, not everything that we think is a crisis is going to blow up the way we think it's going to blow up, and some things that we don't think are going to blow up will blow up. But being prepared for the worst and hoping for the best is probably the best advice I was ever given, which of course is also countered by the advice that a former boss of mine gave, that hope isn't much of a strategy, is it? It's really about preparation. And the great thing that some of these consultings or advisors like Weber Shadrick can bring is they'll anticipate some of what may be coming ahead of time. There are other people who are, have been deeply involved in these types of things, who have retired recently, or nearly, or semi-retired, who have hung out their shingles and are available to advise on some of these things as well. And some of them are on the call right now, I believe. But I think we can take advantage of some of the expertise that might be out there. Don't try to do it all yourself. They have that saying about the attorney who has himself as a client. So don't be that one.
Well, and you offered in your session today some really great techniques that you learned from going through this experiment. I thought that your couple minutes there on voice modulation and volume and tone, you enacted that as you were giving those remarks, and they're great tips, very, very important things that we can take away from this session that are really tangible and file away in that binder on the shelf to remember. But I'd like to echo what you shared about joining and getting involved in ICFSO and SPSP and even the standard development meetings at ASTM,
Yes.
Because you will meet those people. You will meet those industry veterans who have been through this before, if you have not. And collective experience and information sharing really is only to everyone's benefit. Certainly we can learn a lot from those who have come before us, and that's a really important thing to take advantage of, because we can. It's available to us.
Absolutely.
Well, I don't see any other questions from our audience here, so we'll give it a minute just to see if anyone has a burning question they'd like to ask. I will give a plug to sort of address one of the questions that came through earlier as well, about working with the media. Our next session coming up in just a very short period of time, 11:30 Central, 12:30 Eastern. So we have a little break. Will be a session just focused on that, communicating with the media and how we can do that. Our speaker is Jen Schechter with Consumer Reports, so she'll be sharing some great information there as well. So one more question. Do you have, David, any recommendations for templates that could document a retail plan?
So my recommendation would be to take a look at the CPSC website in their business portal. And they actually have templates for a recall plan. It's got, it's generic. There's also an ISO document that talks about recalls, but take a look at those. You'll need to fine tune it and tweak it to reflect your organization. But those, if you don't have one, those are a great place to start. They cover all the must-dos. What they don't necessarily cover is, the public relations stuff that you may have to do with with media, with plaintiffs' attorneys and things like that. But from a regulatory standpoint, if you tick all the boxes on those, the templates that CPSC has, or even the ISO template, and I forget the reference for the recall, but someone will plug into the chat there, and it looks like there's a PAS 7100 in the UK. Thank you. There are that will at least get you through the beginning parts. And again, should you be faced with something that you're afraid is going to blow up in a big way, and it's the first time that you've had to do it, take notes along the way. Try to engage with some experts, and then that becomes your template for the next time you might have to go through it. And you always hope that there won't be a next time, but it's always best to prepare just in case.
Absolutely. So two related questions just coming into the chat here. So the first is, who in the company should lead the crisis management response? And I think we've talked a little bit about that in some of the other webinars we've had. The answer probably is it depends, but David, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. And, sort of the follow-on question from another participant is that best case is for leadership to initiate, but if it does come from the bottom up, how are we making sure we're getting the appropriate resources and the right people are paying attention?
Great questions. And you're right, Lisa, it does depend. In most cases, most companies that I'm familiar with, the final decision to recall rests with somebody with a C in front of their title, or at least a president in front of their title. And often the product safety team is making a recommendation, maybe in partnership with legal, and then the decision maker is somebody who has broad reaching responsibilities for the company. In a case like that, again, the best course of action is not that much different than working with outside media or regulators. Is make sure you have that relationship with those people before you need it. Are you presenting consumer complaints and safety incidents on a quarterly or at least semi-annual basis to those decision makers? Do they know what's coming in from the field? Do they know about your warranty claims? A lot will depend on the nature of your business, but are they seeing the same signals that we see as product safety professionals? Are they aware, at least at a high level, of what those signals are telling us? Are we getting better? Or are there warning signs that, hey, maybe we need to worry about something here? Ideally, those people are part of the safety committee or the people reviewing. I do think that it's usually best if the safety committee is led by the product safety team. I know some teams that's led by legal, and that can work as well. But I think that the people who are closest to the issue leading those in my experience, tends to work best. And you know, there, you know, I asked Michael and during his segment, you know, can you inculcate a culture of safety without having gone through a crisis? And there are conflicting views on this one. I think it's doable, but it's not easy unless, you know, if it comes from the top and the people from the top already have that culture of safety and culture of compliance, maybe from a prior company or a prior role, then it's super easy. You know, I can tell you that one of the easiest roles I've ever had in the product safety world was when I first started with Hasbro, and I was based in the Far East. And the operations leader at the time, Michael Moriarty, was in charge of operations for the Far East. And he used to start every meeting by reminding people that safety and quality are prerequisites to all other priorities that we have. And every meeting, product safety would go first on the updates. And every meeting, you know, every opportunity he had to promote product safety and make sure people are talking about product safety, he never let one slip. And it was not just talk, it was followed up with actions. And that was perhaps the easiest job I've ever had as a product safety professional, because I was fully supported in everything that I wanted to do. They're not all like that. And you know, don't get depressed if you run into some resistance. But when you find yourself in a situation like that, and I hope all of you do at some point in your careers, absolutely cherish it, because as I said, they're not always like that, and know that you're in a special position, and you have a special opportunity when you're presented with those situations.
Absolutely. That highlights a great point made by one of our earlier speakers, Kathy Schaffen, when she was sharing organizational communications techniques about the elevator speech. You know, it's not just for elevators, and certainly we're not sharing elevators very frequently these days, but certainly it's important to always have those little snippets of information that you're sharing with the right people across the company, so the message is consistent.
And I would, you know, add to that, as part of that elevator speech, you don't want the product safety team to only be talking to people when there's bad news to share. And so it's really important to be able to frame the good stuff that you do as well. And it's not always easy because of the nature of our jobs. It's the bad stuff that tends to bubble to the surface and get the most attention. But we need to be better as a profession at talking about the good that we do, not just the crisis management that we're able to do.
Absolutely. And that goes right back to our relationship building. So it's all connected for sure. Well, no more questions. David, thank you so much for taking your valuable time and sharing your terrific experience and wonderful expertise with our audience here today. We certainly appreciate it. And again, thank you to SPSP and ADK for bringing this content to the product safety community. So with that, I will remind everyone we have about a half an hour until our next session, which again is working with the media. And I look forward to seeing all of you back at 11:30, 12:30. Thanks so much.
Lisa.
Bye, David. Thank you.